Let us pray. Lord, I ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. This week a story came in email that I was sure wasn't true. We all have email stories coming around that you think, oh, that's a nice story, but we pretty much figure most of them are made up. But this story caught my attention, so I did some investigation and found that, in fact, it was a true story. And its lessons in hospitality and generosity done with humility were so overwhelming that I thought, yeah, this'll preach. Shortly after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, if you'll recall, all flights were grounded. A small town in Newfoundland hosted 37 planes and thousands of stranded passengers. They'd been forced, of course, to land at the nearest airport, and 27 of these planes were from the U.S. Gander is a small town of just over 10,000 people on the island of Newfoundland. The passengers were apprised of the situation in the States, and they waited hours, some as long as 24 hours, to get off the plane and proceed through customs. There were almost 7,000 passengers who were processed and then transported to neighboring towns and were hosted by the local communities. Schools and meeting halls, lodges and event centers were all opened, and the locals brought bedding to provide for the need. One flight, Delta 15, was taken to a town of Lewisport, about 26 miles from Gander, and they were put up in the local high school, and every need was taken care of. One woman was 33 weeks pregnant, and they sent her home to a family that lived just across the street from the medical center, just in case. All of the elderly passengers were taken to private homes. There were nurses available and stayed with them for the 48 hours they were there. And they set up a call center so that people could make calls back home to check on their family. They had computers available so that people could email their family and friends. The local cable company set up TVs in the high school so that folks could follow along what was happening. Donations poured in with toothbrushes, deodorant, soap, blankets, even some spare underwear because, of course, all of their clothes were left on the plane. They were given tokens to go to the laundromat. But then they also took people on excursions. They went on boat cruises on the lakes and harbors nearby. Some went hiking in the local forests, and the bakers brought in fresh baked bread. Local people cooked and brought in food to feed these unexpected guests. All of their needs were met, and met with joy and enthusiasm. The plain people, as they called them, described the locals as always friendly and with a smile on their face. When it came time to reboard, all the passengers, all 7,000, were brought back and on time boarded their planes to head back on their way. And the crew of Delta 15 described a very different group of people returning to the plane. They had all become friends in the process and had experienced something together they never would again. They exchanged phone numbers and promises to keep in touch. Now you may be thinking that that's a lovely story and that's the end of the story, but in the same way that our scripture has a lesson for both the hosts and the guests, there is also a story that developed after they left Gander. After they left, the guests wanted to do something in return for the host's generosity. So while flying back to Atlanta on September 13th, the passengers of this flight took the challenge of one of the businessmen, and they started a scholarship fund for the students of Lewisport. They collected $14,000 on the flight in pledges, and when the news of this scholarship got out, many, many more donations came in, and they eventually had more than $1 million in scholarship funds for these children.
Wow.
Dozens of students from Gander and the surrounding areas benefited from the return generosity of the guests that fateful day. Our scripture today is a similar lesson in humility and hospitality, and it seems that Jesus is yet again sharing a meal with the Pharisee on the Sabbath. This time he's in the man's home rather than in the synagogue. Last week we learned about Jesus getting in a little bit of trouble, right, for healing someone on the Sabbath. Well, this day he was having a meal with the Pharisees, and he was watching the dinner guests as they came into the meal and noticed that the guests were quite self-important, and they chose for themselves the places of honor. And he shared a parable with them about a wedding banquet. Now, at first glance, we may think that this parable is a lesson in manners. It's bad manners, of course, to presume self-importance and sit in the best spot, right? Well, in first century culture, mealtime was a focal point for more than food and fellowship. There were deeper meanings to these gatherings. A guest to a dinner party would be seated based on their status or honor in the community. It wasn't uncommon for hosts to invite guests in order to gain power over them or to put them into their debt. And Jesus understood this undercurrent of social mores and called both the guests and the hosts on their behavior. In addressing the guests, Jesus quoted Proverbs 25:6-7, which says, "Do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great. For it is better to be told, 'Come up here,' than to be put lower in the presence of a noble." In sharing this scripture, Jesus reminds those present that honor can't be obtained by the guests. Instead, Jesus says to practice humility by choosing the last seat and allow the host to honor you if they so choose. Jesus dares to suggest that we should practice humility in everything we do and allow others to go first. We are to allow others the honor and attention and allow ourselves to stand in the background. Now, this theme of being last isn't new to us. Jesus shared something similar in Luke 13:30, where he says, "Indeed, some are last who will be first, and some are first who will be last." Jesus is begging us to learn this lesson. We are not to self-promote, but to honor God with our humility. We are to humble ourselves. Next, Jesus turns to the host and radically challenges them to change the guest list. He tells them not to invite their friends and family, but instead to invite those who cannot repay them, to find those who are usually excluded, those folks who are relegated to the margins, the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Then Jesus said, "You will be repaid or honored by God and God alone." The only honor that we should strive for is honor from God, not honor from men. We are invited by those who have no means, we are to invite those who have no means to repay or reciprocate. And let's not miss the larger point here and settle on this as just a lesson in manners. This lesson is so much deeper. Jesus reminds us that we must not practice humility as a strategy for recognition. Imagine being in a room at a dinner and everyone fighting over the lowest seat. Can't you see that? But at the same time, have your ear always attuned to them calling your name. False humility is unattractive in every situation. Being humble means that we know and understand that our own worth comes from God, from our acceptance by God, and we are not to be seeking the acceptance or honor of our peers. God accepts all of us, and that levels the playing field. We are all the same in God's eyes, and there is no need for us to be jockeying for position. So how do we retain humility? How do we develop that humility that God requires? Well, first, it helps if we recognize that we do know a lot, but we will never know everything. And in fact, we know very little when we compare it with the sum total of the knowledge in the universe. No matter how much we achieve in our lives, it's still minuscule in the end. We must fight against thinking that we are so great and count up our accomplishments as if they were medals on our chest. God doesn't care how many accomplishments we have. What God cares about is whether we fought for justice, loved kindness, and walked humbly with God. You know, if that sounds familiar to you, it should. It is Micah 6:8. And it says, "He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Second, we can retain our own humility by comparing ourselves not to each other, but to the perfect one, Jesus Christ. If we set our unworthiness in comparison with the radiance of Jesus, pride will die and self-satisfaction will shrivel up. The second half of our lesson today is a lesson in hospitality, and it begs us to ask what our motive is in our generosity. It drives us to extend hospitality to others and to see if we are doing so only to get an invitation in return. Is our hospitality to be the recipient of others' generosity down the road? Have you ever had a thought or a conversation with your spouse about the folks that you've invited over, and why haven't they invited me back? We have. Or do we approach hospitality as if it were a duty we must perform, something like paying taxes where we do it, but we do it grudgingly? Well, they invited us, so we have to invite them. Perhaps our giving is done from the motive of self-interest. We may not know or understand it, but our giving or hospitality might be linked to an investment somehow, a heavenly investment. At the end of our days, our deposits will be tallied up and against our withdrawals, and we hope and pray that we come out at the end with a positive balance. That type of generosity is rationalized selfishness and is not what God intends for us. A third motive for our generosity might be to feel superior. Giving in this manner puts the giver above the recipient, such that the giver looks down on that poor dear soul that needs our charity. You may even feel compelled to give a short lecture with that type of giving. How many of you remember asking your parents for something and then having to endure the lecture to get it? And of course we did. It would be better not to give than to gratify our own vanity or desires for power. The rabbis had a saying that the best kind of giving was the type where the giver didn't know who he was giving to, and the receiver didn't know where it was coming from. The last motive for generosity and hospitality is to do so because you can't help it. And that is the one true way to give. The law of the kingdom is such that if we give to receive, we will receive no reward at all. However, if we give with no thought of reward, our reward is certain. When we become followers of Jesus Christ, we are transformed in the process. We can't help but change how we interact with others. We can't help but give of our time, our talents. To do otherwise is contrary to the will of God. And God started it first, didn't he, when he sent his son Jesus to die for us because he loves us so much. And we are called every day to follow that example. The folks in Gander did what was right for their unexpected guests without regard for any repayment. They responded to the need that was in front of them, and by all accounts were joyful and grateful for the opportunity to make their guests comfortable and entertain them while they were stranded. It is my prayer that we will continue to look for opportunities to respond to the needs here in our community, that we will continue to reach out our hands of hospitality and generosity with a humble heart so that we can truly make a difference.